Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going back in time, way back to the 16th century, to explore the mind of a guy who really shook things up, Martin Luther.
Oh, yeah. Luther's a fascinating figure. Like a lot of these larger-than-life historical figures, his story is one of those that just keeps giving and giving. There's so many different ways to understand him and his impact.
Right, and I think we're going at this from kind of an unusual angle, right? We're not
Hmm.
just talking about Luther, the reformer, the theologian. We're looking at the man himself, the psychological forces that shaped him.
Exactly. We're using this book, Young Man Luther, by Eric H. Erickson, as our guide. It's a really interesting approach because Erickson, a psychoanalyst, he basically uses Luther's life as a case study.
Okay, so kind of like a psych eval of a historical figure.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And Erickson's big argument is that understanding Luther's personal development, like his childhood, his struggles, all of that, is absolutely essential to understanding the actions he took that transformed history.
So to understand the revolution, we need to understand the man. Okay, I'm intrigued. Where do we even start with a life as big and complex as Luther's?
Well, Erickson starts with this really dramatic event. Luther collapses during a choir performance. And we're not just talking about a little fainting spell here. Some people actually thought he was possessed.
Oh, wow. Okay, so right off the bat, we're dealing with some intense stuff. What do we make of a sudden collapse like that? Like, how do we interpret it in terms of Luther's psychology?
Well, even back then, people had different interpretations, right? Like, we've got this priest, Daneful, who attributes the collapse to demonic influence. But then you've got a psychiatrist, Writer, who's seeing signs of mental illness.
So you've got this clash between the spiritual and the psychological explanations, even way back then.
Right. But what's interesting is that both of these interpretations, even though they're totally different, they both kind of point to this inner turmoil that Luther was experiencing, this tension within him.
Yeah, it sounds like this internal conflict was a big part of who Luther was. So where does this inner conflict come from? Like, what are the roots of this?
Well, Erickson points to Luther's relationship with his father, Hans Luther. He was a pretty tough and demanding guy, really pushed Luther hard.
The classic father-son struggle. What was it about their relationship that was so difficult?
I mean, Hans had huge expectations for Luther, wanted him to become a lawyer, a successful one at that, and that constant pressure from his dad created a lot of resentment in Luther, this feeling of never being good enough.
Like he's living under a microscope, constantly being judged. I can see how that would take a toll.
Oh, absolutely. And to really illustrate this dynamic, Erickson brings up some of Luther's own writings where he talks about being beaten by his father, sometimes for seemingly minor things.
So we're talking about harsh discipline.
Hmm.
And that definitely gives us a window into his relationship with authority in general.
For sure. It's this struggle with his earthly father that a lot of scholars connect back to his later struggles with the church. And it makes you think, was Luther ultimately rebelling against all authority?
That's a really interesting question. So we've got this difficult father-son relationship. How does that play into Luther's decision to join the monastery?
Well, think about it. He defies his father's wishes, and instead of becoming a lawyer, chooses the most radical option possible. He basically joins the enemy camp.
So it's like the ultimate act of rebellion. But why a monastery? I mean, wouldn't that be jumping from the frying pan into the fire in a way?
Yeah.
Trading one form of authority for other?
You're right to point that out. The monastery was this world of intense discipline and self-denial. Silence, constant confessions, a laser focus on spiritual matters. It's a world very different from what his father wanted for him, sure, but it's not exactly a walk in the park either.
It sounds like its own kind of psychological boot camp.
Hmm.
What would make someone like Luther, someone already wrestling with all this internal turmoil, choose that path?
It's a great question. And Erickson suggests that for Luther, joining the monastery was about finding what he calls a negative identity. It's basically a complete rejection of everything that was expected of him. Like he's turning away from the world that his father represents and embracing its opposite.
It's like he's saying, I'm not going to be what you want me to be. I'm going to be the complete opposite.
Yeah, and it's a decision that launches him into a world that was designed to break down and rebuild your identity in a very specific way. Remember that fit in the choir we talked about? Well, imagine how the intensity of monastic life might have impacted a guy who was already struggling with that kind of inner conflict.
So we've got the strict father, the monastery, all this internal turmoil, and then Luther goes to Rome. You'd think seeing the heart of the Catholic Church would have solidified his faith, right? Like, this is it. This is where it all began.
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? But it's actually the opposite. What Luther finds in Rome is a lot of corruption, materialism, and a pretty big disconnect between what the church was preaching and what it was actually practicing.
Like going to Disneyland and finding out Mickey Mouse is a chain smoker.
Pretty much. And that experience shatters Luther's idealized view of the church. It fuels a growing sense of disillusionment.
So we've got this strict father, this intense monastic life, and now this disillusionment with Rome. It feels like all the pieces are in place for something big to happen, right? Like we're setting the stage for a major shift.
You're exactly right. All of this is leading up to Luther's revelation in the tower. This is a moment that's going to change everything. But to really understand it, we need to dive into the theological landscape of Luther's time.
Okay, so we're going even deeper down the rabbit hole. Before we get into the theological nitty-gritty, let me just make sure I'm following you so far. We've got this young man, Luther, grappling with a tough father, finding solace, but also more intense struggle in the monastery, getting disillusioned by the church in Rome. Am I getting that right?
You got it. Like all these forces are converging, right?
Yeah.
And out of this perfect storm, you could say, is going to emerge Luther's revolutionary understanding of God's righteousness.
That's what we're building towards. Okay, I am definitely ready to hear about this revelation in the tower, but I'm guessing we're going to have to save that for next time.
Right. We'll dive into that and how Luther's personal struggles combined with this really complex theological landscape led to this revolution that changed the course of history. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.
All right. Well, everybody, we'll be back to continue our deep dive into the fascinating mind of Martin Luther very soon. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.
Okay, so where we left off, Luther's about to have this huge breakthrough. Remember, he's been wrestling with feelings of inadequacy, trying to understand this idea of a God who seems to demand perfection, and then questioning the church. He's not sure it's living up to what it preaches.
Right, like all this pressure's building up. It feels like something's got to give. So tell us about this revelation in the tower thing. What was so revolutionary about it?
Well, at the center of it all is this idea of justification. Like, how do we become righteous in the eyes of God? The common belief at the time, what the church really pushed, was this idea that you had to earn it, like through good works, rituals, even buying indulgences.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
Always trying to meet this impossible standard and never really knowing if you've done enough. I mean, no wonder Luther was going through a crisis.
Exactly. And it's with this backdrop that he has his tower experience. He's spending all this time intensely studying, reflecting, really digging into the scriptures. And specifically, he's looking at Romans 1.17. It's like a light bulb goes off.
Okay, I got to ask.
Yeah.
What's in Romans 1.17 that's so earth-shattering?
It says, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written. The righteous will live by faith."
So it's not about what we do, but what we believe. Righteousness is a gift, not something we got to earn.
That's it. And that just completely flips Luther's understanding of his relationship with God on its head. It's not about this endless striving for perfection that's impossible to reach. It's about accepting God's grace through faith.
I can only imagine how freeing that must have felt for Luther. You know, someone carrying around so much guilt, always feeling like he's not good enough.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a weight lifted. He realizes that God's love is freely given, no strings attached. It's a gift. We receive it through faith, not through our actions.
Wow. No wonder this becomes like the foundation of his whole theology. Justification by faith, I mean, it challenges the core of what the church was teaching. It offers this whole new path to salvation to anyone, not just the elite, the super devout.
Exactly. And this realization, this new sense of freedom, it just infuses everything Luther does from this point on. His preaching becomes even more passionate, more certain, and he starts to openly challenge the church, denouncing indulgences, even translating the Bible into German so people can read it for themselves without needing a priest to interpret it.
Wait, translating the Bible, that's a power move, right? The church was not going to be happy about that.
Oh, they were furious. Luther was cutting out the middleman, giving people direct access to the Word of God, basically saying, you don't need the church to tell you what to believe. Read it yourself and decide.
Wow. Luther, you are bold. So we've got this personal revelation that ignites this huge theological revolution. But let's not forget, Luther is still human, right? He's still got his own issues, his own inner demons to deal with.
Right. Luther's life really shows us that even revolutionaries, people who changed the world, they're still human, with all the complications and inconsistencies that come with being human.
I'm curious about something. If this justification by faith thing was so central for Luther, how did that work with his monastic life? Weren't monastic orders all about works and rituals?
That is a great question. It's where things get even more interesting. On the one hand, Luther's experienced this profound inner freedom. He's not chained to this idea that he's got to earn God's favor. But he's still living in the system where works are seen as the way to salvation.
It sounds like a recipe for like some serious internal conflict. So how did he handle that tension between what he now believed and the system he was a part of?
Well, that tension just keeps building and building until it finally explodes. Which brings us to another turning point. The 95 Theses and that whole controversy around indulgences.
Oh, yes, the 95 Theses. This is Luther taking his revolution public, right?
Yeah.
Nailing his complaints to the church door. Talk about a mic drop moment.
It was a bold move. And you got to remember, indulgences were basically a way to buy your way out of sin, to reduce your time in purgatory. It was a big moneymaker for the church. But Luther saw it as taking advantage of people's fear. It just twisted the idea of God's grace.
So people are terrified of going to hell, so they're paying money to try and secure their spot in heaven. And then you've got Luther saying, nope, not how it works. God's love is free. You can't buy your way in.
Exactly. And with those 95 Theses, he's throwing down a challenge, directly confronting the authority of the church.
I bet that went over well. How did the church react to this very public challenge?
At first, they tried to brush him off like he was just some troublemaker who needed to be quiet. But then Gutenberg's printing press comes into play, and things get really out of control for them.
The printing press. Okay, now that changes everything.
Yeah.
Suddenly, ideas can spread like, I don't know, wildfire.
Exactly. Luther's ideas, they get printed, reprinted, shared all over Europe. It sparks this huge debate and starts to chip away at the church's control over information, over what people believed.
It's like a 16th century Twitter storm.
Yeah. And it all goes back to Luther's personal journey. His struggles, his anxieties, his search for truth, it all fuels his ideas. And because of the printing press, those ideas reach a massive audience.
Wow, so it's like a perfect storm. The right man, the right ideas, the right technology, all coming together at just the right moment to shake things up in a major way.
Okay, so last time, things were getting pretty heated. Luther's 95 Theses, they're spreading like crazy, and the church is not happy about it. So what happens next in this, epic showdown? Well, the church was definitely not going to just stand by and watch their authority get challenged. Remember, they had a ton of power back then, religious and political power.
Right, they weren't about to let some rebellious monk just dismantle centuries of tradition.
Yeah.
So how did they try to, shut Luther up?
Well, first, they tried to get him to come to Rome to, answer for his heresy.
Oh boy, I bet that wasn't a very tempting offer.
Luther knew it was probably a trap, so he refuses to go.
That's a pretty gutsy move. Basically telling the Pope, no thanks.
Yeah.
What did the church do then?
So they condemn his teachings and try to silence him. But Luther is not backing down. He really believes in what he's saying, and he's got a growing number of supporters, and he just keeps writing and preaching, basically just challenging the church at every opportunity.
It's like a theological boxing match.
Right.
Luther versus the church, and neither one is holding back.
Yeah, it's a great analogy, and the tension just keeps escalating until it gets to this huge showdown at the Diet of Worms in 1521. It was this big assembly called by the Emperor, Charles V, to address this Luther problem.
Oh, wow. So now it's not just a church issue anymore. The emperor himself is involved. This is getting serious. What happened at this Diet of Worms?
So Luther is ordered to recant all his teachings, to take it all back and say he was wrong. But in this legendary moment, he stands firm. He says, "My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand. I can do no other."
Wow, that's one for the history books.
Yeah.
This one man standing up to the most powerful rulers in Europe, refusing to back down from his beliefs. That's pretty inspiring.
It is a really incredible display of courage, and this moment really solidifies Luther's place in history. But it also put him in a pretty dangerous position.
Yeah, standing up for what you believe in is great, but it doesn't always mean you're safe, especially when you've just defied the emperor. So what happened to Luther after this?
He's declared an outlaw and excommunicated from the church. That was basically a death sentence back then. But he had supporters, even some powerful German princes who protected him. They saw an opportunity in Luther's rebellion to kind of, push back against the church's power, but on a political level.
So Luther almost becomes like a pawn in this bigger power struggle between these princes and the church. His religious rebellion is now sparking political upheaval.
Exactly. And it just shows how religious movements, they're almost never just about religion, right? They get all tangled up with the politics and social issues, and the results can be really unpredictable.
And in this case, those unpredictable results, they lead to the birth of Protestantism, which really changed the whole landscape of Christianity.
Yeah. The Reformation, it wasn't just some theological debate. It led to wars, political instability. I mean, it reshaped Europe.
But, if we're talking about Luther and his, complexities, I think we have to talk about his stance on the Peasants' War. It just seems so contradictory, right? Here's this guy who is all about challenging authority, and then he supports the brutal suppression of peasants who are just trying to get basic rights. I mean, how do we make sense of that?
It's a good point. And it really highlights how even people who are revolutionaries, they can still be products of their time. Luther might have challenged religious authority, but when it came to social order, he was very much a traditionalist.
So the man who stood up to the Pope was still very much a man of his time. He couldn't totally escape those ideas about hierarchy and social order he was raised with.
Right. It's a lot more complicated than saying Luther good, church bad, or whatever.
Right.
It forces us to recognize that these historical figures, even the ones who fought for progress, they can have these blind spots, they can be inconsistent, they're human.
It's a good reminder that history is complicated. It's full of contradictions, and it's not as easy as just labeling people as heroes and villains. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the mind of young Martin Luther, I mean, what are the big takeaways? What have we learned from this really complex and contradictory figure?
Well, I think Luther's story shows us how powerful personal struggles can be in driving change. His anxieties, his desire to find meaning, his wrestling with these huge theological questions, those very personal experiences, they fueled a revolution that changed the course of Western civilization.
It makes you think about what might seem like personal issues today, the things we struggle with. They might have the potential to spark change in the world, too.
That's a great point, and it's pretty inspiring to think about. Another big takeaway, I think, is how powerful ideas can be. Luther's challenge to the church, it started as this one man speaking out, but it turned into a movement that spread like wildfire and changed the religious and cultural landscape of the West forever.
It's like one person with the right idea at the right moment can really make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. And lastly, I think Luther's story reminds us how important it is to be okay with complexity. He was a man with incredible insights and also some serious flaws, a revolutionary figure who could also be really frustrating.
He pushes us to look beyond those simple stories,
Mm.
the ones where it's all good versus evil. He forces us to look at the nuances of history and the fact that people aren't always one thing or the other.
Exactly. And that process of really wrestling with those nuances, it helps us to understand ourselves and the world around us in a much deeper way.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the mind of young Martin Luther. It's been a wild ride, that's for sure, and I think we've all learned a lot.
It's been a pleasure exploring this really fascinating part of history with you.
And for everyone listening out there, we hope this deep dive has kind of sparked your curiosity. Maybe it's given you a new way of thinking about the power of ideas, how complicated humans are, and the impact that one person's search for truth can have. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.